Chapter 8's topic is political participation and voting. So, obviously, with the title, one of the most common forms of political participation is simply to be an active voter. You could also, however, write to your leadership, and there are face-to-face participation examples such as protests, volunteer work, and town hall meetings. You can see some famous examples of protest here in the background. A famous photo from the anti-Vietnam War movement, another from the anti-Vietnam War movement, and a combination of Vietnam War and civil rights protesting. A much more modern trend for participating in politics is to stay informed via the internet. And you can visit candidate websites before voting about something so that you can educate yourself about the candidate's views of things. You can organize an event by inviting people online. I'll double back to this on future slides. And you can sign an online petition. This is something that previously was only able to be done in a formal on-paper format, and with the advent of the internet, that is obviously something that is much easier to achieve. You can blog online, post to social media, or tweet about political issues to expand the word about something. So online access has made information sharing and participation a lot easier. Now the question is, does that online participation lead to offline participation? There are some examples of yes, it indeed does, such as the Occupy Wall Street movement, where people were protesting the large profit margins of corporations amidst the financial crisis and the suffering of everyday citizens. Muslim Spring in the Middle East, there were a lot of protests that were anti-government, and it was social media that helped share some of the abuses of government against the protesters. Prior to online participation, that information likely never would have gotten out, and the protests would have been stamped out without the rest of the world seeing the violence that took place. And then Stop Online Piracy Act, for short, known as SOPA. There were protests against this, like the government was going to take action on people's use of the internet, and some people did not like that idea. They thought that it was going to lead to censorship. Hence the visual here of the home screen of Google with a black bar over it. Now, what is voter turnout? Turnout really just means how many eligible voters actually show up at the polls. And if you are someone looking to run for office successfully, you want to turn out your voters in higher numbers than your opponent. So a lot of efforts in campaigning are focused on voter turnout. You can see statistics here around the world. 90% or more of people in Italy turn out to vote on a regular basis. Unfortunately, when you go further down this list, we are almost at the bottom here in the United States, with only just over 50% of people voting on a regular basis. And some people only choose to vote in presidential elections, which is unfortunate because they often have much more influence in a local, county, or maybe even congressional district election. Now, factors helping or hindering voter turnout. Socioeconomic status. The poor go to the polls in much smaller numbers than those in middle and upper classes. Now, this is not a direct link. You don't obviously not go to the polls just because you're poor. But when you dig deeper into thinking about that, if you're poor, it is more likely that you have to work multiple jobs, for example, just to get by. So, if you're working multiple jobs, your ability to stay politically informed is much less, and your ability to get to the polls on election day is much less. So the poor go to the polls in smaller numbers, not just because they're poor, but because of some of the circumstances created by the fact that they're poor. A political environment such as a period of national crisis, the Great Depression, World War II, 9/11. Voter turnout increases because people see that moment of crisis and want to have their voice heard in support of or against what the government is doing in those times of crisis. Education. Those with more education are more likely to vote. If you're more informed, you probably have a stronger opinion and will go to the polls. And age. Older voters come out in larger numbers. So the more life experience, much like education, the more of life that you've lived, probably the more opinions that you have formed, and therefore you will go to the polls in higher numbers. Mobilization efforts. Okay, if there's a big get out the vote campaign, then you probably are turning out more voters than your opposition. And if both campaigns for a certain office are running get out the vote efforts, you might see extremely high voter turnout. So get out the vote efforts, mobilizing people to go to the polls, this definitely has an impact. And it can be statistically shown. Races where lots of money was spent on information getting out the vote versus elections where not a lot of money was spent on those efforts. Electoral competition. When there are candidates running unopposed, meaning there isn't even an opponent, there is much lower turnout because what's the point, right? The person's going to get elected even if they only get one vote. Well, when there's competition, voter turnout is higher because people have a preferred candidate. Incarceration rates. The more people who go to prison, the fewer eligible voters there are, especially if you've committed a felony, then you are oftentimes not eligible to vote for the time that you are spending in prison. Rates of incarceration are therefore very controversial, especially in minority communities, because the connection can be made if you put more and more and more of a certain demographic of people in prison, then you are taking away their right to vote. Proof of identity. Some places require photo ID in order to go to the polls and vote. And this is a very controversial issue because some believe, well, that provides for election security. It prevents any kind of wrongdoing on election day. Others point out that not everybody has a photo ID. They're not licensed drivers, for example. And if they have no photo ID, how do they then prove their identity? So this, while being controversial, is something that can aid one group that has the access to this and harm another that does not have access to this. And then Tuesday Election Day is actually something that has been discussed numerous times in the United States. Many other countries have voting going on for multiple days and or election days sometimes on the weekend so that working people have a better chance to get to the polls. Now, with that discussion, it leads me to want to discuss things like same-day registration and early voting. Same-day registration means you're not a registered voter, but you show up on election day and you can both register and vote in the same day. It is popular in many states, but opponents say that it encourages fraud because people can sometimes vote in multiple places, for example, registering in those multiple places, and by the time that is figured out, they have already impacted the outcome of an election. Now, those examples are pretty few and far between. There have been people convicted of doing things like that, but same-day registration, especially if coupled with something like photo ID, many states do this successfully. Permanent absentee ballots. In particular, in sparsely populated western states where it would be a long, long trip to get from home to a in-person polling place, some states allow citizens to be on a list to receive their ballot by mail every single year. Expanded use of mail-in voting during the coronavirus pandemic became a very controversial issue because some people wanted to say that mail-in voting opened up opportunity for fraud and possibly impacted the outcome of some races, and it's a two-sided issue. There's people that say, big issue, we shouldn't allow large amounts of mail-in voting without a reason, and others who say you shouldn't need a reason to vote via mail, you should be able to do so. So this is probably not an issue you're going to see resolved anytime soon, given how deeply controversial it is. Then you have early voting. Voters can actually cast a ballot up to 40 days prior to the actual election, depending on where they live and what the laws surrounding that are. No research has ever really shown that voter turnout is impacted by early voting, because some people who would normally show up on election day just take advantage of that early voting period. So there's really no statistics that show that having a period of early voting impacts turnout one way or another. Lastly, voting blocks and how to woo them, how to win them over. So the black community is more so than other groups living in persistent urban poverty. And that means that many black voters really want to hear from candidates that they are going to offer help or aid in those impoverished black neighborhoods. Those messages are most shared by the Democratic Party, so the result is that the black community trends Democratic. Latinos. Immigration reform is often the topic that they care about most, especially if their families are divided, meaning only some live in the United States, others live in a Central or South American nation. The party pushing immigration reform harder is the Democratic Party, so in general, Latinos are trending more Democrat, but actually in recent years, there have been an increasing number of Latinos voting Republican because they are much more concerned with things like an increase in urban crime. Exit polls show that they, as well as black communities, are often living in crime-ridden communities, and they want more policing, and that is much more of a Republican message. So Latinos are actually, although trending Democrat, not doing so in nearly the large numbers that they once were in recent years, and it remains to be seen whether that is a trend that is going to continue. Are Republicans going to continue to attract more Latinos, or is this just a temporary thing based on increases in crime in a particular time period? Other voting blocks. So Asian Americans have no particular issue that they are more interested in than another, but they have tended to trend Democrat since 1992. In 1992, that changeover, prior to that, Asian Americans voted much more Republican, but since 1992, for no particular reason, Asian Americans tend to vote more Democratic. Women. Women are a growing voting bloc that candidates try to appeal to. They particularly are concerned with close-to-home issues like education, healthcare, public safety, etc. Women are often considered the leaders of the household. I know that's true in my household. Mrs. Baker is what makes everything run smoothly. So women, given that they are most concerned over education, healthcare, public safety, because as leaders of their family, that is what they're most concerned with, a lot of the messaging surrounding these issues leads women to trend more Democratic. And lastly, young people. Ever since President Obama ran for office and then was reelected again 4 years later, young people are trending much more Democratic. President Obama was a young candidate, especially young considering that he was running for president. Usually older politicians end up running for president. And some of the messages that he was sharing with young people, such as stronger environmental laws, education funding, sometimes even downright messaging like free college, and more tolerance towards personal freedoms. This results in the trend towards the Democratic Party. This is the end of the presentation. Obviously, if you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, I'll see you in class.